The mountain man rescued a girl left for wolves, and she wouldn't let go of his shirt. The mountain man heard the wolves before he saw them, their low, circling growls cutting through the pine-thick dusk like threads of cold iron, and he tightened his grip on the axe in his right hand as he stepped quietly between the trees, boots sinking into half-frozen needles, breath steady, but coiled with the instinct of a man who'd lived too long in places where the dead didn't always fall to bullets first. When he reached the clearing, the scene hit him like a blow to the chest. A girl, no more than 20, dress torn, wrists raw from rope, was pressed against a fallen log, while 5 wolves formed a ring around her, shoulders lowered, eyes bright with hunger. She wasn't screaming. She didn't have the breath. Her fingers clawed helplessly at the bark behind her as if she could disappear into it. The mountain man, Elias, though no one had spoken his name in months, let out a low, guttural sound that wasn't a word, but a warning shaped from the throat of something bigger than fear. The nearest wolf snapped its head toward him. Elias lifted the axe. "Not tonight." The wolves hesitated, uncertain, weighing this new threat, before hunger pushed them forward. Elias moved first. He launched himself into the clearing with a force that cracked the air, swinging the flat of the axe into the first wolf with a bone-deep thud, spinning to shove the second back with his shoulder as he roared loud enough to shake the tree line. Snow burst upward with every strike, the fight a blur of teeth, claws, and the mountain man's brutal certainty. One wolf lunged for his leg. He kicked it aside. Another leapt for his throat. He caught it mid-air and slammed it down hard enough that it yelped and fled limping into the dark. The others followed, scattering like smoke chased by sudden wind, until the clearing fell silent except for the girl's rattled breaths. Elias dropped the axe and approached her slowly, aware that a man his size, giant, bearded, carrying the wild on his skin, looked more dangerous than the wolves she'd just escaped. "You hurt?" he asked quietly. She didn't answer. Couldn't. Her eyes were wide, frozen open, pupils blown so large he could barely see their color. When he crouched in front of her, she flinched. But when he reached out a hand, intending only to steady her, she lurched forward so fast it surprised him and latched onto his shirt with both fists, clinging like she'd fall into the earth itself if she let go. "Easy," he murmured, voice low and rough as winter bark. "I got you." But she only pressed closer, shaking so violently he could feel the tremors through his ribs. Elias lifted her carefully, one arm beneath her legs, her fists still locked into the fabric of his shirt. "All right," he whispered, settling her against his chest as her head dropped to his shoulder. "You hold on." And she did, so tightly that even as he carried her toward his cabin through the gathering night, not even the cold could pry her fingers loose. Elias moved through the trees with careful urgency, each boot step deliberate, controlled, yet faster than he'd moved in months, the weight of the girl light against his chest, but the weight of her terror heavy as iron on his shoulders. Her fingers were still knotted tight in his shirt, curled so hard the fabric stretched under the strain, and every time he tried to adjust his hold, she whimpered. A small, broken sound that wasn't loud, but carried the sharpness of someone who expected pain to follow every breath. Her forehead rested against the base of his throat, her breaths shallow, uneven, little puffs of cold air warming his skin as she trembled uncontrollably. She'd gone past fear into shock, the kind of shock that swallowed a person whole, and Elias knew if he didn't get her warm soon, the wolves wouldn't be the ones to finish her. The forest thinned as he climbed the last bluff toward his cabin, the wind cutting wicked lines across her torn dress. She shuddered harder, clinging even tighter, and he lowered his voice to the softest rumble he possessed. "Ain't nobody else here," he murmured. "Just me, Just warmth. You're safe now." But the word safe landed like she didn't know what it meant, like it was a language she'd never heard spoken honestly. When they broke through the timber and his cabin came into view, small, rough-hewn, a plume of smoke curling from its chimney, her grip changed, not loosening, not relaxing, but shifting, as if some instinct in her recognized shelter before her mind did. Elias opened the door with his shoulder, stepping inside where firelight painted the walls in steady gold. He set her down only long enough to shut out the cold. But the second her feet touched the floor, she buckled, collapsing into him with a terrified gasp, hands clawing again for his shirt. "Easy," he said, catching her before she hit the ground. "I ain't putting you down if you can't stand." Her breath hitched like she was trying to speak, but no sound came, just a strained, panicked swallow. She was freezing, soaked in patches, her skin cold enough that touching her felt like brushing ice. Elias carried her to the fireside and knelt, keeping her pressed to him, because she wouldn't let go, and because a part of him, buried under years of solitude and silence, didn't want her to. He slid a thick buffalo blanket around both their shoulders, letting the heat from his body surround her. "You're all right," he whispered again. "You're all right now." And slowly, very slowly, her trembling changed. Not gone, not eased, but shifting from terror to something closer to fragile survival, her fingers still fisted in his shirt, as if he were the only solid thing left in a world that had tried to kill her. Elias didn't try to pry her loose anymore. He'd learned in the first few minutes that every time he shifted even an inch away, her breath caught like she expected a blow. So he simply adjusted his body around hers, lifting her a little higher as he settled against the stone hearth, letting the fire's heat soak slowly into her frozen limbs, while keeping his arms loose enough not to cage her but firm enough to tell her she wasn't falling anywhere. The cabin was quiet, except for the crackle of burning pine, the soft hiss of melting snow on her torn hem, and the ragged rhythm of her breathing as she tried to understand where she was, and who he was. Her fingers had knotted deeper into his shirt, so tight the seams creaked, and when he gently shifted to grab a kettle off the hook, she let out a sharp sound, half gasp, half plea, and buried her face against his chest like that single movement meant he was about to disappear. "Easy," Elias murmured, stilling instantly. "I'm just reaching for hot water. Nothing more." She responded with a tiny nod, barely a dip of her head, but it told him she was still here, still conscious under all that terror. He poured the steaming water into a tin cup, mixed it with a bit of cool snow until it was warm instead of scalding, then brought it close to her lips. "Drink if you can." She stared at the cup, then at him, like she couldn't decide whether anything he offered might hurt her. When he didn't push, didn't force, didn't crowd, she leaned forward just enough to sip, hands shaking too much to take the cup herself. The first swallow hit her stomach, and she flinched, letting out a tiny, broken whimper. But she kept drinking, and he kept steadying the cup, feeling her trust shift by the smallest fraction. "You been out there long?" he asked softly. No answer, just a trembling breath against his ribs. He didn't push. "Wolves don't circle unless they're starved or something drew 'em." That made her entire body stiffen in his arms, a sudden, rigid tension that told him more than any words could have. Someone put her out there on purpose. Elias didn't curse. He wanted to, but the fury rose slow and deep inside him like volcanic heat. He breathed through it. She didn't need anger. She needed steady, needed warmth, needed a man who wouldn't abandon her the moment she closed her eyes. The firelight played across her face now, revealing dirt smudges, a swollen cheek, rope burns around both wrists, signs of a story she was too scared to speak yet. He adjusted the blanket around her, his voice dropping to a low rumble. "Ain't nobody getting to you here. Not wolves, not men, not anyone." And for the first time since he'd carried her from the clearing, she shifted her hold, not loosening, but resting her forehead fully against him, as if the cabin, the warmth, and the mountain man holding her were the first things in hours that didn't feel like death closing in. The heat from the fire slowly tamed the violent shaking in her limbs, but the girl never loosened her grip on his shirt. Not when he shifted to stoke the flames, not when he adjusted the heavy buffalo blanket around her shoulders, not even when exhaustion dragged her closer and closer to sleep until her eyelids fluttered like moth wings fighting the dark. Every time her head dipped, she jerked awake with a panic so sharp it vibrated straight through Elias's ribs, fingers clawing at his shirt as if waking meant the world would swallow her whole. "It's all right," he murmured each time, voice low, steady, patient as mountain stone. "You don't gotta stay awake. I'll keep watch." But she didn't believe him yet. He could feel it in her breath. Quick, shallow, tripping over itself like every inhale was a risk. She tried to fight sleep longer. Her fingers flexing in the fabric, knuckles white, muscles shaking with the effort to stay conscious. But her body had limits, and shock was already dragging her under. When she finally slumped fully against him, her cheek resting over his heartbeat, Elias stayed perfectly still, barely breathing, afraid even the smallest movement would jolt her back into the terror she'd been drowning in. Her fingers stayed locked in a death hold on his shirt, one hand twisted near the collar, the other knotted at his ribs. He tested her grip gently, just enough to see if she'd loosen in sleep. But even unconscious, she clung harder, a small whimper escaping her as if some nightmare pulled her backward into whatever hell she'd escaped. Elias exhaled slowly, settling deeper against the hearth, letting her weight rest fully on him. He'd lived alone in these mountains for years, hunted bears with nothing but grit and a rifle, slept under storms that broke lesser men. But nothing had ever felt as fragile or as heavy as the girl curled against his chest. He studied her face in the firelight, the faint bruise under her eye, the rope burns, the dirt streaked down her jaw from tears mixed with mud, and a slow, cold realization crept over him. Someone didn't just abandon her. Someone meant for her not to survive. Wolves didn't tie wrists. Wolves didn't leave a girl in torn shoes and a ripped dress on a trail where no one traveled, unless they knew the land. And whoever those men were, they weren't far. Elias scanned the corners of the cabin, checking doors, windows, shadows, ensuring everything was bolted, locked, tight. Then he lowered his head again, jaw tight, voice a low promise against her hair. "You hold on," he whispered. "Ain't nobody taking you from me tonight." Outside, the wind howled against the cabin walls, but inside, she clung to him even in sleep, like he was the only thread she had left in a world that had already tried to tear her loose. Elias waited until her breathing settled into a fragile rhythm, the kind that told him she was deep enough in sleep that lifting her gently wouldn't rip her mind back into terror. And when he finally slid her weight against the pile of blankets beside the fire, carefully, slowly, without prying her fingers from his shirt but guiding her hand so his folded coat lay beneath it. She didn't wake. She only whimpered once, her knuckles twitching, and he froze until her breathing found its rhythm again. Then he rose, muscles tight from holding still so long, and stepped outside into the brittle cold. Dawn hadn't arrived yet, but a gray-blue hint of it lay low along the ridge, just enough to illuminate the clearing and the tracks. Not wolf, not even close. Elias crouched, fingertips brushing the snow where deep prints cut a path through the trees. Heavy and purposeful, boots with a worn heel and a drag on one side like the man had an old injury. 2 sets of prints, one leading toward where he'd found her, one leading away. Human. Adult. Men. And judging by how clean the top snow was, they'd returned after he brought her into the cabin. Close, watching, waiting to see if she'd die in the cold so they wouldn't have to bloody their own hands. A low, dangerous sound formed in his chest, something between a growl and a promise. Elias followed the prints a few yards into the trees, stopping where the forest thickened. The men had stood here a long time, enough for the snow to pack down beneath their boots, close enough to see him fighting the wolves, close enough to see her in his arms, close enough to decide whether they wanted to finish what they'd started. But the tracks turned back downslope. They hadn't left for good, just for the night. They'd be back. He straightened slowly, jaw grinding as he scanned the trees, reading the land like a second language. Whoever they were, they knew these mountains. But not like he did. Not like a man who'd lived through 3 winters alone, who could disappear into the pines and reappear behind a threat without leaving a whisper behind. When he stepped back into the cabin, shutting out the cold, she stirred, her hand still curled in his coat like she felt him leave even through sleep. He knelt beside her again, letting his presence settle her until her breaths evened out. "You weren't left for wolves," he whispered, anger threading low through his voice. "They wanted the wolves to finish it." Her eyebrows twitched. Pain. Memory. Fear rising like a shadow against the fire's glow. "But I ain't letting that happen," Elias murmured, drawing the blanket up to her shoulder. "They come back. They'll answer to me." Outside, the wind carried a faint echo. Not wolves, not weather. Just the quiet, bone-deep certainty that whoever had left her here wasn't done. And neither was he. She woke just as the sun finally crested the ridge, a faint whimper catching in her throat, as if the rising light dragged old nightmares with it, and Elias was beside her before her eyes fully opened, one hand braced gently on the floor near her shoulder, so she'd see him first, not the shadows of a cabin she didn't know. Her grip tightened instantly, fingers curling around that same fistful of his coat, and when she recognized him, some of the panic in her gaze softened into a fragile, trembling relief. "Easy," he murmured. "You're in my cabin. Fire's warm. Wolves are gone." But at the word wolves, her body jolted, breath hitching like she was falling backward into the clearing again, and she shook her head with a jerky desperation that told him everything. Wolves weren't the only thing she was running from. Elias didn't push her to speak. He poured warm water into a tin cup and held it to her lips again. She drank a little, wincing as the heat traveled down her throat, then pulled back suddenly, eyes darting to the door with a fear sharpened by memory rather than imagination. And that's when he knew the moment was right. Not gentle enough to overwhelm her, not too soon to shatter what trust she'd built in the dark hours before dawn. "Men were here last night," he said quietly, watching her face instead of the window. The reaction was immediate. Her breath froze, her fingers spasmed in his coat, knuckles whitening. Her pupils widened with a fear that wasn't new. It was remembered. Wilder. Deeper. "I tracked the prints," he continued softly. "2 of them. They came looking. Not to save you." She squeezed her eyes shut, a sound escaping her throat. Not quite a cry. Not quite a word. More like the sound of someone whose voice had been torn out long before the wolves came. Elias shifted closer, lowering his voice to a steady rumble meant to anchor her. "You know who they were." Her head jerked once, a tiny nod, sharp with terror. "They tied your wrists," he said. "They left you there. Wolves don't do that, men do." She swallowed hard, her jaw trembling as if fighting some invisible chain, her breath coming in shallow bursts. "Why?" he pressed gently. "Why'd they leave you?" It took her a long time to answer, and when the sound finally came, it wasn't words. It was a rasp, a whispered fragment forced past a throat tight with old bruises. He said, "I wasn't needed." The way she choked on the last word made Elias's hands curl into fists against the floorboards, fury climbing through him like wildfire. Not needed. As if she were baggage, as if she were disposable, as if leaving her to wolves was a decision made without hesitation. He leaned forward, rough voice threading with a promise she could lean on. "They're wrong," he said. "Dead wrong." She trembled, clinging to him like his certainty was the first thing in days that didn't break her. Outside, somewhere deep in the pines, a crow called once, a cold, hollow sound that told Elias the men who left her weren't far, and coming back was only a matter of time. The girl had just begun to breathe without shaking when the sound drifted in. Faint at first, muffled by distance and snow, a low rumble of men's voices carried on the wind like a storm rolling down the ridge. And Elias felt her entire body go rigid against him, fingers locking around his coat with a strength born not of power, but of terror. She didn't look toward the door. She didn't need to, because the moment those voices reached the cabin walls, her breath turned thin and fast, her eyes wide with a fear so raw it made his pulse flash hot with protective instinct. Elias rose slowly, peeling her trembling fingers from his shirt only long enough to tuck the buffalo blanket around her shoulders. But the moment he straightened, she lunged, catching his coat again. This time with both hands. The blanket falling half off her, as if the only warmth that mattered was the one standing between her and the outside world. "I ain't leaving you," he said, crouching so she could see his face. Steady, calm, absolute. "But I gotta see who's out there." She shook her head violently, tears building so fast they blurred her vision. She tried to mouth a word, not even a full word, just a broken plea. But fear stole the sound. Elias laid a hand gently over hers. "They ain't getting to you," he said. "Not through me." When her fingers loosened half an inch, trusting just enough to let him stand, he rose and stepped softly to the window. The glass was fogged from cabin heat, but he wiped a clear line with the side of his thumb and leaned forward. 2 men on horseback. The same 2 whose tracks he'd followed before dawn. Both rough-looking. Coats stiff with old blood and mud, rifles laid across their saddles. They weren't searching. They were waiting, watching the cabin door like they expected someone to walk out carrying a half-dead girl as if she were a chore. "You see something?" one called to the other. "Smoke's fresh." "He took her inside," the second replied, voice sharp with annoyance. "Idiot should have let the wolves finish it." Elias felt a cold calm settle through him. Not rage, not yet, just the steady, burning awareness of a man who'd spent years alone, learning exactly what he was capable of when pushed. He stepped back to the girl, who was curled against the hearth, rocking slightly as if bracing for the moment the door burst open. "Them?" he asked quietly. Her breath caught. Then she nodded, one tear streaking down her cheek. "They ain't taking you," he said, kneeling so she could grip his coat again. "They ain't even coming through that door." Outside, the horses shifted. A boot hit the ground. Snow crunched under a man's weight. Elias felt the girl flinch as if every sound outside pressed against her skin. He leaned close, voice dropping to a low promise that rumbled through her trembling fingers. "If they think I'm handing you back." His jaw tightened, eyes darkening like storm clouds over the pine peaks. "They don't know what kind of man lives in these mountains." And when the knock finally came, hard, arrogant, demanding, she didn't scream. She only held tighter, and he only grew stiller. The kind of still that meant danger for the men outside, not the girl inside. The knock came again. Harder this time, the kind of pounding meant to remind whoever was inside that men with rifles waited on the other side. And the girl jerked so sharply the blanket slipped from her shoulders, her fingers clawing deeper into Elias's coat, like she expected the door to explode inward at any second. Elias didn't move at first, letting the stillness settle through him the way only a man who'd survived winters, wolves, and worse could. Then he gently pried her grip just enough to stand, though she caught his sleeve with a frantic, shaking hand that made him pause. "I ain't going far," he murmured, lowering his head so she could see his eyes. "You'll see me the whole time," her breathing steadied by a fraction, enough that she didn't collapse when he stepped away from her, but she kept her hand extended toward him like a lifeline, fingers trembling in the air. Elias positioned himself between her and the door, one hand resting calmly on the latch, though nothing in him felt calm. He opened it just a sliver. "What do you want?" he asked, voice low and controlled. Outside, the two men straightened, clearly surprised to see someone built like Elias instead of a girl half-starved and shaking. The taller man leaned forward, smirking beneath a patchy beard. "We're looking for something that ain't yours." Elias didn't blink. "You left her to wolves." "Wasn't wolves we were worried about?" the other muttered. "She's trouble. You don't want her." The girl let out a tiny, wounded sound behind him, a soft inhale that cracked down the middle, and Elias's hand tightened around the edge of the door so hard the wood creaked. "Say that again," he said quietly. The taller man shrugged. "She's ruined. Couldn't follow instructions. Too much mouth. Too little sense. We figured nature would take care of it." Elias opened the door fully then, not as surrender but as warning, his massive frame filling the threshold, shadow cutting across the snow like a blade. "You ain't taking her," he said. The men exchanged looks, their expressions sharpening. "We didn't ask," the shorter one said. "We're telling you." He reached for the rifle strapped to his back, but he never got his hand around it. Elias stepped down from the cabin porch in one slow, deliberate motion. Boots crunching into the snow with the finality of a man who'd decided the outcome before the first move was made. "You boys got two choices," he said, voice calm, deadly calm. "Turn around, or find out if this mountain feeds bodies back to the wolves." The shorter man opened his mouth to spit some insult, but his gaze flicked past Elias, just for a second, to the girl inside, huddled and trembling, eyes huge with terror. And Elias saw it, the recognition, the reason. These men weren't strangers. They knew her, and they weren't here to reclaim her. They were here to silence her. "She ain't speaking to nobody," the tall one said. "Not after we're done." Elias didn't roar, didn't lunge, didn't lift his fists. He just stepped closer, eyes dark, jaw set, voice dropping to the kind of quiet that froze even the wind. "You won't touch her." He didn't need to say more, because the men suddenly understood something they hadn't when they rode up the trail. Wolves were easier prey than a mountain man protecting someone who clung to him like life itself. And the girl, still gripping the corner of his coat, watched him stand there, immovable, and for the first time, the terror in her eyes shifted to something new, something steadier, something that looked a little like trust. The men backed off for the night, not out of fear, but out of calculation, riding just far enough downslope to vanish behind the timberline, while Elias stood in the doorway until their silhouettes dissolved into the dark. Only when the branches stopped shaking from their passing did he close the cabin door and turn back toward the girl, who hadn't moved an inch from her place near the hearth. knees tucked to her chest beneath the blanket he'd wrapped around her, fingers still fisted in his coat like letting go meant the world outside would swallow her whole. He crouched in front of her, lowering himself slowly so she wouldn't flinch, and waited, saying nothing, doing nothing, just offering presence the way a fire offers heat without demand. Little by little, her breathing steadied. And after a long stretch of silence broken only by the crackle of pine logs, she whispered her first full word since he found her. "Please." Elias shifted closer, his voice soft. "Please what?" She shook her head, throat working like the words were stuck behind bruises he couldn't see. Her fingers tightened in his coat again, dragging him closer. "Don't let them take me." The plea wasn't loud. It didn't have to be. It was the kind of sound that carried the weight of months, maybe years, of someone being treated like a thing instead of a person. Elias exhaled slowly, jaw tight. "Ain't no one taking you?" Her eyes lifted, just a flicker, wide and desperate, searching his face like she was trying to see if he meant it, or if he was like the others who made promises with hands ready to break them. "They'll kill me," she rasped. "Or worse." Elias didn't look away. "Not while I'm breathing." She blinked hard, tears spilling over, dripping down her dirt-smudged cheeks. For the first time, she loosened her grip, not to release him, but to unclench, her fingers sliding from a terrified claw into a trembling hold. He took her hand, not pulling, not trapping, just letting their palms rest together. "Tell me what happened," he said quietly. She swallowed again, breath shuddering, and her voice came in fragments, each one shaking loose like stones freed from a landslide. "They bought me, from the man who raised me." Elias's gut twisted. Bought. "Said I was trouble," she whispered. "Said I talked back. Said I wasn't worth keeping." She drew in a trembling breath. "They were taking me somewhere. I don't know where." Her voice cracked, but she pushed through. "I ran. They caught me. Said if I ran again, they'd make sure nobody ever found me." The next words collapsed into a sob. "So they left me for the wolves." Elias closed his eyes briefly, swallowing the fire rising up his throat. When he opened them, his voice was steady stone. "They won't touch you again. Not alive." She stared at him, breathing fast, then slower, then steadier, like the truth she'd carried alone had been tearing at her ribs and speaking it, let her breathe for the first time in days. The sky outside brightened, dawn creeping slowly over the peaks, and she exhaled a shuddering breath, a breath that sounded like someone choosing life again. And when she leaned toward him, fingers finding his shirt once more, Elias understood that dawn wasn't the only thing rising. A fragile, new kind of trust had taken its first breath, too. Dawn poured through the cabin's small window like a gentle hand, lifting the night away, softening the corners of the room, and washing the fear from the walls where it had clung like frost. The girl sat beside Elias near the hearth, wrapped in the buffalo blanket, her fingers still curled into the front of his shirt. Not in terror this time, but with a tentative steadiness, like she was learning what it meant to hold on without bracing for pain. Outside, the sound of horses drifted up the slope again, slow and deliberate, but different now. Not searching, not hunting, but waiting. Elias rose to his full height, and this time when he stood, she didn't panic. She rose with him, using his shirt to guide her, staying tucked against his side as if the connection itself was strength. "You sure?" he murmured, glancing down, voice low but steady. She nodded, though her chin trembled. It wasn't courage she lacked. It was practice. Elias stepped to the door and opened it onto the pale morning light. The two men were there, their horses stamping in the snow, rifles slung casually, but their eyes sharp with an expectation that made Elias's jaw grind. "Mornin'," the taller one called, tone dripping with false confidence. "We're here for what's ours." Elias didn't step aside. Neither did she. The girl's grip tightened on his shirt, and she pressed half a step behind him. But she didn't hide her face. She lifted it. Bruised, pale, but unbroken. That alone made the men stiffen. "She ain't yours," Elias said, voice quiet enough to vibrate more than echo. "Never was?" The shorter man sneered, shifting in his saddle. "You don't know what she is." Elias stepped forward just enough to make both horses shy back. "I know she ain't meat for wolves." The taller man spit into the snow. "Move, mountain man. She belongs to—" "Herself," Elias cut in, and the words hit the cold morning air like an axe splitting ice. The girl flinched, not in fear, but in disbelief. No one had ever said that for her. The men exchanged looks, then swung off their horses, hands drifting toward their rifles. Elias didn't retreat. He didn't even shift his feet. But the calm that settled over him was the dangerous kind, the kind that came from knowing you would break before you bent. "You take another step," he said, voice dropping to a low gravel, "and you ain't leaving this mountain." The shorter man snorted, raising his rifle halfway, but before he could level it, the girl stepped fully beside Elias, chin raised, fingers still knotted in his shirt like she was anchoring herself to truth rather than terror. "I'm not going with you," she whispered. It was small, but it hit like thunder. The men froze, stunned that she'd speak, stunned she'd defy them, stunned she wasn't too broken to stand. "You heard her," Elias murmured. The taller man hesitated long enough for Elias to see the truth flicker through him. They'd hoped she'd die, that the problem would solve itself, that their crimes would be swallowed by snow and wolves. But now she lived, and she spoke, and she chose. And that choice was their undoing. The rifle lowered. The men mounted up again, faces twisted with a fear they'd deny until death. "This ain't over," the taller one spat. "It is for you," Elias replied. They rode off without looking back. The girl sagged against him, breath shaking, but she didn't collapse. And when he turned back toward the cabin, she followed, bare feet in the snow, hand fisted in the fabric of his shirt, taking each step like she was claiming ground no one had ever let her stand on before. She entered the cabin, holding on to him, not out of fear anymore, but because choosing him, choosing safety, choosing herself, that was the first real freedom she'd ever tasted.